go to page 52 in your journal and get these definitions. Now let's take a look at the core concepts. In this section, we're talking about the square root of a negative number. So before, we thought we couldn't take the square root of a negative number. And you can't do this in real numbers. But if I have the square root of negative r or something, x, I can take out the negative and replace it with this letter I. So if we have the square root of negative 3, I can replace it with I square root 3. Also, we can say that I squared is equal to negative 1. So if I have I times the square root of 5 all squared, that's I squared times 5. That's negative 1 times 5, which is just negative 5. So we're really using here that the definition of I is the square root of negative 1. Let's take a look at our examples. Go to example 1 in your notes packet, and we're going to find the square root of each of these numbers. So we know that the square root of negative 25 can be broken down into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. And we know the square root of negative 1 is I. So this little guy here is I. And this here is 5. So I can write my answer like 5I. It's kind of like I is the variable x, but it has a meaning. It's not just any number. So now for 72, I'm going to write that this is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 72. But I have to break down 72 and simplify it. So I know we're going to get an I somewhere in our answer. And then 72 is the same thing as 36 times 2. So I'm going to say my final answer here is 6I square root 2. And then for part C, I see a negative 5 out front, so I keep that negative 5 there and I'll multiply by it in the end. And then I have square root of negative 1 times square root of 9. So I'm going to say that's negative 5 times I times 3, because the square root of 9 is 3. So what's that going to be? Just multiply the 5 and the 3. So we've got negative 15I. Now we're looking at page 53 of your journal, and it says to add or subtract two complex numbers. Their real parts and their imaginary parts are separate. So if I have, for an example here, if I had 6 plus 2I plus 5 minus 3I, then I would just combine the real parts, so 6 and 5, that's what it's saying to do here. Combine the real parts, A and C, so that would be 11. And then combine the imaginary parts, which would be BI and DI. So 2I minus 3I is minus 1I. So my answer would be 11 minus I if I combined like terms here. Now let's look at example 2 in your notes packet. And remember, we're going to add or subtract, combine like terms here. And we know that A plus BI and C plus DI are equal if and only if A is the same thing as C and B is the same thing as D. So this means we have to find X and Y to make this statement true. So I know my real part, 2X and 10, have to be equal. And my imaginary part, negative 7I and YI, have to be equal. So just set 2X equal to 10. So then X would equal what? 5. And set negative 7I equal to YI. The I's will cancel out, kind of like if X's would. And I'll just say negative 7 equals Y. Now take a look at example 3. This is adding and subtracting complex numbers, kind of like we saw in the journal there. So for part A, I'm just going to say 8 plus 5 is going to be 13. And negative I plus 4I gives me 3I. And there's my answer. Standard form, make sure, is A plus BI, so that means the imaginary part has to come second. So we did that right in part A. Looking at part B, I have 7 minus 3 gets me 4. Then I have negative 6I minus negative 6, so that becomes plus. So if I write minus 6I plus 6I, these guys cancel out, right? And this just equals 4 for part B. And then looking at part C, if I write my workout here, I'm going to distribute this. Think of that like a negative 1, and I'm going to distribute it. So 13 minus 2 minus 7I plus 5I. If it helps you to rewrite these, you could have rewritten A and B as well. So now I have 13 minus 2 is 11. Minus 7I plus 5I is going to be minus 2I. And there's my final answer. Now go to example 5, and similarly, we can multiply with I. So I'm going to get negative 24I plus 4I squared. Think of it like x for now, but then whenever we get an I squared, you have to replace it with negative 1. Always. So here I'll have negative 24I plus 4 times negative 1. So that's just negative 4. And remember, we have to write it in standard form. So I have negative 24I minus 4, but I have to write the I part second. So I'm going to have negative 4 minus 24I. And then if we try part B, we're just going to FOIL, just like we would if we were multiplying with x. So I'm going to multiply each of these parts. We'll get negative 36 plus 63I plus 8I minus 14I squared. So I combine my i's in the middle, my like terms, and then I change I squared to a negative 1, and that means I have plus 14. So I'll have negative 36 plus 14, and then plus 71I. So that should equal what? It should be negative 22 plus 71I.